All right, so how's everybody doing? This is the Practica LTL, which I recently purchased, and I put a test roll through it, and the camera appears to be working just fine. The negatives came out beautifully. Here they are. We got good spacing, good exposure, so it looks like the shutter speeds are reasonably accurate, and the advanced mechanism is working smoothly. And so I can confidently say that, yeah, it works. Except the light meter, but the light meter was advertised as being non-functional when I bought the camera, so no big deal. This is a thoroughly conventional, built like a tank SLR of the late 60s, early 70s. It's very typical of the cameras of its period, and I don't mean that as a put down. Indeed, the old built like a tank SLRs happen to be my personal favorite class of cameras. So. To me, that's a good thing. That this is, similar to the Nichromats, the auto-reflexes, the Minolta SRTs, the Canon FTB, and so forth. Very similar. So you basically got your standard control placement, shutter speed 1 to 1000 plus B, advance. That's your frame counter. It's your index mark for the shutter speeds. Rewind crank over here, pentaprism, hot shoe, and in front you got the self timer over here. The only sort of non-standard-ish control placement is the shutter release, although back in the 60s there were a couple of there were several Japanese companies that made SLRs with shutter release buttons in this position. I'm thinking of let's see, Miranda, Topcon, Petri, perhaps others, but this actually isn't. I mean, I said it's a non-standard control placement, but not really so much. There's your self-timer. There's your, well, on this camera this functions as a stop-down lever, but this would activate the light meter. When you push it back, it stops down the lens and activates the light meter, which again, very typical for M42 series cameras. Most M42 cameras, the vast majority, required that you stop down the lens to working aperture prior to taking a light reading. So you would do it like this. Bottom of the camera simply has the rewind button, battery door, and tripod mount. And let's see, the only other really non-standard or unique feature of this camera that I can think of is the film loading system, which has an easy loading device whereby you put your canister over here, you pull the leader across, and you just lay the leader flat on here. It has to extend as far as that green mark right there, and then you just advance a frame, and you see these silver well, bars, wires, whatever, they're going to come around and clamp down on the film leader, which avoids the necessity of having to thread the film leader into a slot in the take-up spool, which sometimes can cause misloading. Sometimes you miss it and it doesn't catch. So it's a clever system. Obviously, I've only used it once, so I'm going to withhold judgment on it for the time being. It seemed to work reasonably well the one time that I did use it, but I'll hold off on further comment until I've got a little more experience with it. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the Practica L series and just give a little bit of background information on this particular series of camera. And here we go. The information that I'm giving you is coming from a couple of websites, which I will link to down below, 2 websites in particular. And the information on those websites pretty much jived and was consistent, with minor variations, minor discrepancies, but again, it's because of inconsistent series naming or sub-series. Anyway, it's the information I'm going to give you, I'm pretty sure is at least reasonably accurate. Maybe not 100%, but pretty darn close. Okay, so the Practica L series, these cameras, well, this camera comes from the first generation of the Practica L series, which was introduced in 1969. And it continued in production through 1989 for a total production of 4.8 million units. That's over a 20-year period, and over 40 models. So the Practica L series was a very successful series of cameras during this period. I'm going to describe the series with reference to its feature set. That is, there are certain, basically there were like 5 variations of 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, no, 6. Six major variations of the Practica L series, which had various models, which were sort of, had slight updates along the way. So there was a meterless model. There was a model of this camera sold without a light meter. So it would have looked identical to this, except it wouldn't have had the metering switch. Obviously, wouldn't have a battery door because it wouldn't take a battery. On these cameras, the battery, with a few exceptions on these cameras, the battery operates the light meter only. Otherwise, it's completely battery independent and works well mechanically. So the L and L2 were meterless. Roughly 440,000 units were produced. The TTL, that is through the lens stop down. TTL here, I mean through the lens. So this is cameras with a through the lens light meter and stop down metering, which such as this. That describes this camera right here. And those cameras included the following models: the LTL, which is what I have, the LTL2, the LTL3, MTL3, DTL3, MTL5, MTL5B, MTL50, TL3, and Super TL1000. All of these models basically share the same feature set. I don't think there's any major differentiations between any of these models right here. If you know differently, please leave a comment, but I'm pretty sure it's safe to say that all of these models had shutter speeds from 1 to 1000, and they featured a light meter like this one, which was you stop it down, take a light reading, and it used a center weighted metering pattern, as far as I know. I think that's correct. So this series, or this set of models, the through the lens stop down metered models, account for 3.3 million units. That is, I think, 69% of total production, or over 2/3. So that is over 2/3 of all Practica L series cameras produced during this 20-year period were basically this camera and its descendants. So this is easily the most popular version of the Practica L series, by far. We then have some through the lens stop down cameras with a maximum shutter speed of 1/500. That is, it's essentially identical to this, only you're missing the 1/1000 shutter speed. And that would be the TL, the Super TL2, the Super TL3, and the Super TL500. Approximately 120,000 units were produced, so not a whole heck of a lot. You also have a set of cameras with an uncoupled external meter. So there's some of these cameras that have a light meter window like right here. And I think it's selenium. I'm not sure. I think they might be, well, I don't even know. It's either selenium or cadmium sulfide. Frankly, I don't know, don't care. If I get one, I'll review it. But the point is, it's an uncoupled external light meter. Those were fairly common in the 1950s, not so much by the 60s, but there was a budget version of the Practica L series which did have an uncoupled external light meter. That was the LB and the LB2 for about approximately 186,000 units produced. Let's see here. We then come to the flagship series of the Practica L line, and that was the LLC, the PLC2, the VLC2, and the PLC3. These cameras were essentially shared the same features as this. The upgrade is that you could take a light reading at full open aperture. And the way they did that was by using electrical contacts. The problem with the M42 mount was that there was no way, mechanically at least, that the mount wasn't designed to let the lens communicate mechanically with the camera and let the camera know which aperture was in use. It just wasn't thought of at the time that this mount was invented. So some manufacturers, I believe Practica was the first. The electric series will have these 3 large, broad electrical contacts around the lens mount, around here, around this area here. They will mate with similar contacts on the back of the lens. Obviously not this one. This is not an electric series. And they will electronically communicate the aperture data to the camera, and that's all it's doing. It's still mechanical shutter. The camera still fires mechanically and without batteries, but if the light meter is working, you can, and if you have the proper lenses with the proper electrical contacts on the back, then you can meter with the lens wide open as opposed to having to stop it down like this one. And that accounted for about 411,000 units, or not even 10% of total production. So the flagship models, I'm guessing they must have been very expensive because they just didn't, I mean, it was a bragging point for Praktica, I suppose. I think they were the first company to invent a full open aperture metering system using electrical contacts in an M42 camera, I think. I know that a couple of Japanese companies, I know Fujika had a similar system, perhaps one or two others. But I think Praktica was the first, so sort of have bragging rights for that. But in terms of production, this is less than 10%. We then have, the next series is the electronic shutter aperture preferred automatic exposure. So these, quote, electric cameras were still manual exposure. It's a match needle manual metering. That is, there's a circle inscribed in the focusing screen and a needle that moves up and down, and just like in the other built like a tank SLRs of the period, you adjust the exposure controls, that is, you adjust the aperture and the shutter speed until that needle is centered in the middle of that little circle on the side of the focusing screen, and that tells you that your exposure is accurate. So that characterizes this set of cameras, and also the electronic, that characterizes this set of cameras and also this set of cameras. So this set, however, it has an electronic shutter. That is, the shutter is battery dependent. It will not function without a battery, and it offers aperture preferred automatic exposure, where the photographer sets the aperture and the camera will set a shutter speed, and that would be a stepless shutter speed anywhere between 1 second and 1/1000th of a second. That's one of the main advantages of the aperture preferred AE, is the stepless shutter speeds. I've never used one, never seen one reviewed. I have no idea how reliable they are, frankly. Me personally, I prefer to avoid first generation electronic shutter, automatic exposure cameras. I just think the technology was immature and unreliable in most of them. I'm thinking of the electronic nichromats, the electronic spotmatics. I know there are people who have those things and they work and they swear by them, but I do not trust the reliability of first generation electronic automatic exposure cameras. Anyway, maybe that's just my hang-up, I don't know. These cameras were also private labeled for JCPenney, the American department store, and two West German retail outlets, I should say, Porst and Fotoquell, no idea, under the Revuflex name. So they were exported to the West. And I believe, and here I'm going to make a bold statement, and I'm not sure if this is true or not. I think that, with the possible exception of Russian vodka, Pentagon cameras and lenses were the only consumer products made in the Communist East and successfully marketed in the West. I think that's true. Now, maybe I think that's true because I grew up in the United States, where no one had any interest in buying communist manufactured anything, frankly. Perhaps in Europe, where the attitudes were a little softer, maybe, I don't know. Could you get an East European dishwasher back in the day? I really don't know. You know, were Eastern European manufactured refrigerators marketed in Western Europe? I'm going to guess no, but I could be wrong. You know, maybe if you know better, then please do leave a comment. I don't mind being wrong if I'm giving you bad information. But I really think that the Praktica line, and I think this is something to be proud of. I think this is something that the Pentagon people ought to be proud of. I really think these cameras and lenses were the only major set of consumer products of any kind, whether we're talking about razor blades or washing machines, which were manufactured in the Soviet bloc, we would have called it back then, you know, the Eastern Bloc, behind the Iron Curtain. You know, the socialist communist countries have aligned with the Soviet Union during the 1950s, 1960s, 70s, 80s, and up to 89. So I think that these represent the only set of consumer products made in the Communist East and successfully marketed in the West, and they were successfully marketed. Apparently, the Praktica line of cameras were fairly common in Great Britain. I read that or heard that somewhere. that these were actually marketed fairly successfully there. I know they were sold in the United States, but I don't know how successfully or how much market penetration they got back then. I suspect not a whole heck of a lot, but you know, I'm not really sure. Okay, so that's what I've got for you today. A little bit of information about the Practica LTL and the history of this particular line of cameras, which is I mean, look, assuming this thing works, I mean, and this does work. I mean, this camera is 40 plus years old, and it's working perfectly well, as far as I can tell. This is a viable budget option, and if you're looking to get into film photography on a shoestring budget, again, my one test roll of this camera, it works fine. It's comfortable to use. No particular quirks, no hang-ups, nothing stood out, and I didn't have any issues with it, at least on that first roll of film. So I'm cautiously optimistic about the Practica line of cameras, and if you have knowledge or information about Practica or something you'd like to share, please do leave a comment. I'm happy to learn what I don't know. Hope you have found this video useful, enjoyable, entertaining, or a combination thereof, and if so, please do like, subscribe, and check out the links down below. Take care. Bye-bye.